December 1944, a frozen courtroom in the Belgian town of Bastogne, and Major General Raymond Clark sits behind a scarred oak table reviewing a court-martial file that should be straightforward, but somehow isn't. The accused stands at attention 15 feet away, Private Thomas Dawson, 23 years old, charged with desertion in the face of the enemy, a crime punishable by death under the Articles of War. The evidence is damning. Dawson abandoned his infantry unit during the German Ardennes offensive, disappeared for 6 days while his battalion fought desperately to hold their position, and was apprehended 40 miles behind the lines wearing civilian clothes and carrying forged identity papers. By every measure of military justice, this is an open and shut case requiring the harshest punishment to discourage other men from abandoning their posts when the fighting gets brutal. But on Clark's desk sits a second file, delivered just hours before the scheduled execution, containing sworn statements from 40 Belgian civilians, farmers, shopkeepers, a priest, 2 teachers and 33 children, all testifying that Private Thomas Dawson spent those 6 missing days pulling them from the rubble of their bombed village, organizing their evacuation through German lines, and ultimately saving their lives at tremendous personal risk, while his own army considered him a coward and a traitor. Clark has been a soldier for 26 years, commanded men in 2 wars and signed more execution orders than he cares to remember, but he's never faced a case quite like this, where the definition of duty splits into 2 irreconcilable truths, where a man is simultaneously guilty of the worst betrayal a soldier can commit and innocent of any crime against humanity. By December 1944, Allied desertion rates had reached crisis levels, with over 21,000 American soldiers having abandoned their units since D-Day, and commanders like Clark were under immense pressure to make examples of deserters to maintain discipline. The question haunting him as he reads these Belgian testimonies isn't whether Dawson broke military law, he clearly did, but whether a man who saved 40 lives while risking his own deserves the same fate as a coward who ran from danger to save his skin. What happens when the rules that hold armies together collide with the values that make us human? When following orders means ignoring an atrocity and breaking them means becoming an outcast? This is the story of Thomas Dawson, a combat infantryman who became a deserter because he chose to save civilians over maintaining his post, and Raymond Clark, a career officer who had to decide whether military justice should account for moral complexity or simply enforce the black and white rules that keep soldiers fighting when every instinct screams to run. To understand Thomas Dawson, we need to understand the world that shaped him, a working-class America still climbing out of the Depression, where patriotism and survival were deeply intertwined, and young men saw military service as both duty and opportunity. Born in 1921 in the coal mining town of Scranton, Pennsylvania, Thomas grew up in a community where the mines had been the only employer for 3 generations and where the economic collapse of the 1930s hit with devastating force. His father, Patrick Dawson, had worked underground for 32 years until a cave-in crushed his left leg in 1935, leaving him permanently disabled and the family dependent on Thomas's mother's income from taking in laundry and mending. Thomas was 14 when his father was injured, and he left school to work odd jobs, delivering newspapers, sweeping floors at the local general store, helping farmers with harvests, contributing every penny to keep his 3 younger siblings fed. This early exposure to hardship bred a fierce sense of responsibility and protectiveness that would define his adult life, a conviction that when people were in danger, you helped them regardless of personal cost, because that's what decent humans did. The Dawson household, despite its poverty, maintained a strong Catholic faith, and Thomas served as an altar boy at St. Patrick's Church, where Father Michael O'Brien taught him that service to others was the highest calling, that material success meant nothing if you ignored suffering when you had the power to alleviate it. These lessons took root deeply, shaping Thomas's moral framework in ways that would later put him at odds with military authority. The cultural and geopolitical landscape of the late 1930s was one of gathering darkness, as fascist movements in Europe grew increasingly aggressive, and the specter of another world war loomed over a generation that had barely recovered from the last one. Thomas watched these developments through newsreels and radio broadcasts, hearing about Hitler's annexations and Japan's conquests in China, and like many young Americans, he felt conflicted. Part of him believed that Europe's problems weren't America's business, but another part recognized that unchecked aggression eventually threatens everyone. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Thomas was 18 and working as a coal sorter, a brutal job that paid 22 cents an hour and offered no future beyond a lifetime underground, followed by an early death from black lung disease. The military began to look like an escape route as well as a patriotic duty, especially after the draft was instituted in September 1940, making service inevitable for men his age. Thomas enlisted in January 1941, 11 months before Pearl Harbor, joining the Army Infantry with dreams of seeing the world beyond Scranton and perhaps learning a trade that would give him options after the war. His motivations were typical of his generation, a mix of patriotism, economic necessity, and youthful adventure-seeking, none of which prepared him for the psychological horror that combat would inflict. Basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, ran 16 weeks and was designed to transform civilians into soldiers through a brutal combination of physical conditioning, weapons instruction, and psychological conditioning that aimed to override the natural human reluctance to kill. Thomas excelled at the physical aspects. Years of manual labor had made him strong and resilient, but struggled with the dehumanization training that required him to think of enemies not as people, but as targets to be eliminated. His drill instructor, Sergeant Harold Matthews, was a great war veteran who'd seen combat in the Meuse-Argonne offensive and who taught his recruits that hesitation in combat meant death for you and your buddies, that killing was a skill to be mastered like marksmanship or grenade throwing, and that moral questions about the ethics of war were luxuries that soldiers couldn't afford. Thomas completed training in May 1941 and spent the next 18 months in various stateside postings, missing the initial Pacific campaigns but preparing for eventual European deployment. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, his entire unit gathered around a radio in stunned silence, listening to reports of the devastation and understanding immediately that their training was about to become terribly real. The transformation of American society during 1942 was total and rapid, industry converting to war production, rationing becoming universal, and the mobilization of 12 million Americans into military service, creating a sense of shared national purpose that transcended the political divisions of the Depression era. Thomas's letters home from this period, preserved by his sister Margaret, reveal a young man trying to maintain connections to civilian life while preparing psychologically for combat. He wrote about missing his mother's cooking, about worrying whether his father's disability pension would be enough with inflation, about hoping the war would end quickly so he could come home and maybe open a garage since he'd learned engine repair in the motor pool. These ordinary concerns and modest dreams were typical of millions of young soldiers, none of whom could fully grasp what modern industrial warfare would do to them psychologically. In November 1943, Thomas shipped out to England as part of the massive build-up for the cross-channel invasion, assigned to the 28th Infantry Division that would land at Normandy on D-Day +2 and fight across France into Germany. The 6 months he spent in England were a strange interlude of tedious training exercises, intense camaraderie with fellow soldiers, and growing anxiety about the invasion everyone knew was coming. He befriended several men from his platoon, particularly a Brooklyn kid named Danny Rosenberg, who'd been a jazz musician before the war, and a farm boy from Iowa named Carl Jensen, who could field strip a Browning automatic rifle blindfolded and who kept everyone's spirits up with elaborate pranks and terrible jokes. The challenges Thomas faced began not with combat itself, but with the transition from training to actual warfare, a psychological gulf that no amount of preparation could fully bridge. The 28th Infantry Division landed at Normandy on June 10, 1944, 4 days after the initial assault, and immediately entered combat in the hedgerow country of Normandy, where German defenders had turned every field and lane into a death trap. Thomas's first exposure to combat came during an assault on a German position near St. Lo, a grinding battle where his company spent 5 hours crawling through mud and explosions to advance 300 yards, losing 19 men killed and 37 wounded in the process. The sensory overload was unlike anything training could simulate. The ear-splitting concussion of artillery, the smell of explosives and burning flesh, the screams of wounded men calling for medics, and the terrible randomness of death, where the man next to you could be obliterated by a shell while you emerged without a scratch. Thomas performed adequately in those first engagements, following orders and doing his job, but privately he was terrified and struggling to process the violence he was both witnessing and participating in. Modern psychological research on combat trauma has identified a phenomenon called moral injury, distinct from PTSD, that occurs when soldiers witness or participate in actions that violate their deeply held values. For Thomas, raised with strong Catholic beliefs about the sanctity of life and the obligation to help those in danger, killing, even in the context of legitimate combat, created profound internal conflict that he had no framework to resolve. His unit medic, a conscientious objector named Samuel Klein, who served as a non-combatant, noticed Thomas's struggles and tried to help, explaining that compartmentalization was how most soldiers survived psychologically, that you had to separate your wartime actions from your peacetime values and accept that war created moral exceptions to normal ethics. But Thomas found he couldn't compartmentalize as effectively as others, especially after an incident in late July 1944 that would haunt him for the rest of his life. During a firefight near the town of Coutances, his squad was pinned down by German machine gun fire coming from a farmhouse, and their lieutenant ordered them to suppress the position with rifle grenades and assault it. Thomas and 5 others advanced under covering fire and cleared the house room by room, killing the 3 German soldiers manning the machine gun. After securing the position, they discovered 4 French civilians hiding in the cellar, an elderly couple and their 2 granddaughters, aged perhaps 8 and 10, who'd been unable to evacuate when the fighting started. The children were terrified, screaming and crying, and the grandfather had been hit by shrapnel during the assault and was bleeding from a shoulder wound. Thomas immediately began treating the injury, while one of his squad mates went to fetch the medic, but their lieutenant, focused on tactical objectives and worried about booby traps, ordered them to leave the civilians and continue advancing to secure the next position. Thomas argued that the grandfather would bleed to death without treatment, that the family needed to be evacuated to the rear, where they could receive proper care, and the lieutenant responded by threatening him with insubordination charges if he didn't follow orders immediately. Thomas complied, but the look of betrayal and terror in those little girls' eyes as American soldiers walked away from their wounded grandfather was something he couldn't forget or justify. When they returned to that farmhouse 2 days later during consolidation, the grandfather was dead, and the family had disappeared, whether evacuated by other Allied units, captured by retreating Germans, or killed in subsequent fighting. Thomas never learned. This incident crystallized Thomas's growing conviction that the military's single-minded focus on tactical objectives often ignored the humanitarian obligations that should take precedence when civilian lives were at stake. He became known in his unit as someone who would go out of his way to help French civilians, sharing his rations with hungry children, warning villagers about minefields, carrying wounded civilians to aid stations, even when it meant falling behind his unit during advances. His platoon sergeant, a veteran named Robert Wilson, appreciated Thomas's compassion, but worried it would get him killed or worse, court-martialed, and repeatedly warned him that a soldier's first duty was to his unit and his mission, not to civilians in a war zone. These warnings intensified as the 28th Infantry Division pushed across France during August and September 1944, fighting through the liberation of Paris and then continuing eastward toward the German border. The campaign was brutal and exhausting. Weeks of continuous combat with minimal rest, constant casualties that eroded unit cohesion as replacements who'd never trained together were thrown into veteran squads, and a growing sense among the men that the war was going to continue far longer than the optimistic predictions of early summer had suggested. By October 1944, when Thomas's division reached the German border and prepared to assault the Siegfried Line, he'd been in continuous combat for 4 months and was showing signs of severe combat stress, difficulty sleeping, hypervigilance, emotional numbing except when he saw civilians in danger, which triggered intense protective responses. The breaking point came in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West that caught Allied forces completely by surprise and created chaotic battlefield conditions where normal command structures broke down. On December 16th, German forces launched a massive attack through the Ardennes forest, hitting American positions with overwhelming force and creating a bulge in Allied lines that threatened to split the British and American armies. Thomas's 28th Infantry Division was positioned directly in the path of the German assault, specifically near the town of Wiltz in Luxembourg, and they found themselves surrounded and fighting desperately to hold key positions while waiting for reinforcements. The combat during those first days of the Bulge was unlike anything Thomas had experienced. German tanks and infantry advancing relentlessly, American positions being overrun, units fragmenting as soldiers became separated from their commands, and refugees streaming westward trying to escape the fighting. On December 18th, Thomas's platoon was defending a crossroads near a small Belgian village called Benonchon when German artillery began systematically destroying the village to eliminate any cover for American defenders. Thomas watched buildings collapse under shell fire and could hear civilians screaming, trapped in basements or pinned under rubble, and every instinct told him to help them while military discipline demanded he maintain his defensive position. His lieutenant, a replacement officer who'd only joined the unit 2 weeks earlier, ordered the platoon to hold the crossroads at all costs and specifically forbade anyone from entering the village because it would expose them to German fire and split their defensive strength. But when Thomas saw a building collapse and heard children screaming from under the rubble, something inside him broke, or perhaps crystallized into absolute moral clarity. He made a decision that would define the rest of his life and put him in front of a firing squad. He laid down his rifle, told his squad he was sorry, and ran toward the burning village to help the trapped civilians. Behind him, his lieutenant was shouting orders to return to position. His squad mates were calling him back, but Thomas kept running because those screams were the screams of the French girls whose grandfather had bled to death while he followed orders, and he couldn't live with that guilt again. The next 6 days were a blur of desperate humanitarian work, under impossible conditions, pulling civilians from collapsed buildings, organizing their evacuation through German-controlled territory by traveling at night and hiding during the day, treating wounded with the medical supplies in his pack until they ran out and he had to improvise with torn cloth and prayer. The civilians he saved, 40 men, women and children from Benonchon, would later testify that Private Dawson worked with superhuman endurance, barely sleeping, sharing his rations until he had nothing left, and repeatedly risking his life to guide them through German positions to reach Allied lines. A Belgian priest named Father Antoine Dubois kept detailed notes of those 6 days, documenting how Thomas had organized the group, prioritized evacuating the wounded and children, and maintained morale even when they faced situations that seemed hopeless. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, Thomas successfully led the last group of civilians through German lines and delivered them to American forces near Bastogne, and that's when military police arrested him for desertion. The immediate aftermath was bureaucratic and brutal. Thomas was taken into custody, stripped of his weapons and equipment, confined in a makeshift stockade, and charged with desertion in the face of the enemy under Article 75 of the Articles of War. The military justice system in wartime operated with terrifying efficiency because commanders needed to maintain discipline and couldn't allow the perception that abandoning one's post was acceptable regardless of circumstances. Within 48 hours, Thomas was court-martialed by a panel of 9 officers who heard testimony from his lieutenant about his abandonment of his defensive position, reviewed the tactical situation that had required every soldier to hold their ground, and deliberated for less than an hour before finding him guilty and sentencing him to death by firing squad. The speed and severity of the judgment was driven partly by the crisis atmosphere of the Battle of the Bulge, when American forces were desperately trying to contain the German breakthrough and desertion rates were spiking as soldiers panicked under the unexpected assault. General Dwight Eisenhower had made clear that desertion would not be tolerated and that commanders should make examples of deserters to discourage others from abandoning their posts. Thomas's case seemed straightforward. He had willfully abandoned his position during combat, disappeared for 6 days, and was found behind the lines, all textbook elements of desertion. His defense attorney, Captain Robert Mitchell, argued that Thomas hadn't intended to permanently desert, but rather had responded to an immediate humanitarian crisis and had always planned to return to his unit once the civilians were safe. He presented Thomas's excellent service record, testimony from his platoon mates about his courage and dedication, and even got the lieutenant to admit under cross-examination that the defensive position Thomas abandoned had ultimately been overrun anyway, so his absence hadn't changed the tactical outcome. But the court-martial panel wasn't swayed by these arguments because they weren't judging whether Thomas had good reasons for leaving his post. They were judging whether he'd left his post at all, and on that point, the evidence was indisputable. What the panel didn't know and what wouldn't emerge until weeks later was the full scope of what Thomas had accomplished during those 6 days. The 40 Belgian civilians he'd saved had been scattered by the chaos of battle, evacuated to different locations, and their testimonies hadn't been collected or forwarded to military authorities because the Red Cross and military government units handling civilian refugees were overwhelmed with thousands of similar cases. It was only after Father Dubois learned through Red Cross channels that the American soldier who'd saved his parishioners was sentenced to death that he began the frantic process of collecting sworn statements, tracking down the families Thomas had evacuated, and compiling evidence that might convince American authorities that this was not a simple case of cowardice. Father Dubois' efforts were complicated by the fact that he spoke limited English, that communication channels were disrupted by ongoing combat, and that military bureaucracy moved slowly even in urgent cases. By the time he managed to get a comprehensive file to Major General Raymond Clark, the division commander, who had authority to approve or commute the execution, it was January 8, 1945, and Thomas's execution was scheduled for January 10th, giving Clark less than 48 hours to review the new evidence and make a decision that would either end a young man's life or set a precedent that orders could be disobeyed for humanitarian reasons. Clark was a career officer who'd graduated from West Point in 1919, served in various peacetime assignments during the interwar years, and taken command of the 28th Infantry Division in September 1944 after his predecessor was relieved for failures during the Hurtgen Forest Campaign. He had a reputation as a strict disciplinarian who expected absolute obedience to orders, but also as a man who genuinely cared about his soldiers and took his responsibilities seriously. When Father Dubois' file arrived at his headquarters, delivered personally by a Red Cross official who emphasized its urgency, Clark was in the middle of planning a counter-offensive to push German forces back across the Rhine, managing a division that had suffered over 40% casualties during the Battle of the Bulge, and dealing with a desertion crisis that had seen 53 men from his division abandon their posts in December alone. The last thing he needed was a complicated case that would require him to question whether the military justice system he'd relied on his entire career was adequate to handle the moral complexities of modern warfare. But Clark was also a man who'd lost his own son at Guadalcanal 2 years earlier, and he couldn't read the testimonies from those Belgian families, particularly the accounts from children describing how the American soldier had carried them through the snow, had given them his own food, had told them stories to keep them calm while German patrols passed nearby, without thinking about the kind of man who would risk everything to save strangers' children. The psychological struggle Clark faced was profound. On one hand, he knew that military discipline required harsh punishment for desertion, because once soldiers believed they could abandon their posts without consequences, unit cohesion would collapse and battles would be lost. On the other hand, he recognized that Thomas Dawson hadn't deserted out of cowardice or self-preservation, but had chosen to honor a higher moral obligation, and that executing a man for saving 40 lives would be not just unjust, but would fundamentally undermine the values that Allied forces claimed to be fighting for. Clark spent January 8th and 9th interviewing witnesses, including Thomas himself, Father Dubois through an interpreter, and several of the Belgian civilians who'd managed to reach Allied lines and were temporarily housed in refugee centers near Bastogne. Thomas's testimony was particularly striking because he showed no self-pity and made no excuses. He acknowledged that he'd broken military law, said he understood the consequences, but insisted he would make the same choice again because listening to children die while he followed orders was something he couldn't live with. When Clark asked him why he hadn't requested permission to help the civilians instead of simply abandoning his post, Thomas explained that his lieutenant had already forbidden anyone from entering the village and that requesting permission again would have wasted time that those trapped civilians didn't have. Clark pointed out that insubordination was still insubordination regardless of the reasons, and Thomas agreed, but added something that would stay with Clark for the rest of his life. "Sir, I took an oath to defend my country, and I've done that for 4 months of combat, but I took an oath before that, at my confirmation when I was 12 years old, to serve God by serving others. Those 2 oaths conflicted on December 18th, and I chose the one I took first. If that makes me a deserter in the Army's eyes, then I'm a deserter, but I'm not a coward and I'm not a traitor, and I'll face whatever punishment you decide I've earned." The moral clarity in Thomas's statement was unsettling because it challenged the fundamental military principle that soldiers must subordinate their individual judgment to command authority. If every soldier could decide when orders conflicted with personal ethics and act accordingly, military operations would become impossible, and the hierarchical structure that made armies effective would collapse. But Clark also recognized that blind obedience to authority was what had enabled the Nazi regime to commit atrocities across Europe, that the Nuremberg trials currently being planned would judge German officers who claimed they were just following orders, and that there had to be some limit to how far obedience should extend when orders conflicted with fundamental human values. The climactic moment came on the evening of January 9, 1945, when Clark sat in his office, reviewing the execution order that required only his signature to become final. Outside, a winter storm was depositing fresh snow on a landscape already devastated by weeks of combat, and in a cell 100 yards away, Thomas Dawson was writing final letters to his family, while a chaplain sat with him, providing what comfort he could. Clark had consulted with his staff. His judge advocate had advised that commuting the sentence would set a dangerous precedent and encourage other soldiers to abandon their posts claiming humanitarian justifications, while his chaplain had argued that executing a man for saving children's lives would be morally indefensible and would haunt everyone involved. The decision was Clark's alone to make, and he understood that whatever he chose would define not just Thomas Dawson's fate, but also how history would judge them both. The psychological weight of this responsibility was immense. Clark had signed execution orders before for soldiers convicted of rape or murder, crimes where moral certainty was possible, but this case offered no such certainty, only competing obligations and the recognition that both options carried profound costs. If he approved the execution, a genuinely heroic act would be punished with death, sending a message that the military valued tactical objectives over human life and that soldiers should ignore civilian suffering to avoid jeopardizing their own status. If he commuted the sentence, he would be seen as weak on discipline at a moment when desertion threatened to become epidemic, and other commanders might lose confidence in the military justice system's ability to maintain order. Clark wrestled with this decision for hours, and what finally decided him was a realization that emerged from his own combat experience. Soldiers fight not just because they're ordered to, or because they fear punishment, but because they believe in something larger than themselves, and the moment they stop believing that their cause is just, no amount of discipline can keep them fighting effectively. The Americans were fighting to stop fascism and defend democratic values, including the principle that human life has inherent worth and that protecting innocent people from violence is a moral imperative. If the military executed a soldier for living out those values in their most uncompromising form, what message did that send about whether those values were real or just propaganda? At midnight on January 9th, Clark made his decision. He would commute Thomas Dawson's death sentence to time served, plus dishonorable discharge, effectively expelling him from the military, but sparing his life. The written order Clark composed explained his reasoning in language that was both legally precise and morally thoughtful. While Private Dawson's actions constitute a clear violation of Article 75 and cannot be excused from a military discipline standpoint, the circumstances surrounding his absence, specifically his successful effort to save 40 Belgian civilians from imminent death, demonstrate moral courage of the highest order and reflect credit upon the United States Army and the Allied cause. To execute a soldier for such actions would be to value procedural compliance over the humanitarian principles we claim to defend. Therefore, while upholding the finding of guilt to maintain discipline, I am commuting the sentence to time served and dishonorable discharge, recognizing that Private Dawson has paid a sufficient price for his violation through the loss of his military career and standing. This order was legally unusual and philosophically sophisticated, acknowledging the validity of both military discipline and moral autonomy, and it would become a significant precedent in later discussions of military justice reform. Thomas Dawson was released from custody on January 10, 1945, the same day he was scheduled to be executed, and was processed out of the Army within 72 hours. His dishonorable discharge meant he would receive no veterans' benefits, would carry the stigma of having been expelled from military service, and would face significant barriers to employment as most employers were unwilling to hire men dishonorably discharged from wartime service. He returned to Scranton in late January 1945, emotionally shattered by the experience and uncertain about his future, and discovered that his hometown viewed him as a disgrace. The local newspaper had run a small story about his court-martial, and neighbors who'd once been friendly now crossed the street to avoid him. His mother and siblings remained supportive, but his father Patrick, who'd served in the Great War and who held traditional views about military honor, struggled to accept what Thomas had done, and they remained estranged for several years. Thomas found work doing manual labor, jobs that didn't require background checks or references, and tried to rebuild a life while carrying the dual burden of having saved 40 people and being officially branded a deserter. The psychological toll of this period was severe. Thomas developed what would now be diagnosed as PTSD and major depression, experiencing nightmares about the civilians he'd saved, mixed with nightmares about the combat he'd experienced, struggling with guilt about having abandoned his squadmates even though he believed he'd made the right choice, and feeling profound alienation from a society that celebrated veterans while treating him as a pariah. He refused to seek help because admitting to mental health struggles in 1945 was seen as weakness, and he certainly couldn't access Veterans Administration services since his discharge barred him from those benefits. The only person outside his immediate family who maintained contact was Father O'Brien from St. Patrick's Church, who'd known Thomas since childhood and who understood the theological and ethical dimensions of what he'd done. Father O'Brien helped Thomas process the experience through the lens of Catholic moral theology, explaining that the tradition recognized situations where conflicting obligations created genuine moral dilemmas with no perfect solution, and that Thomas's choice to prioritize saving lives over following orders fell within a long tradition of conscientious objection to unjust authority. These conversations provided some comfort, but couldn't erase the social consequences of Thomas's dishonorable discharge. The resolution of Thomas Dawson's story unfolded gradually over decades, and his vindication came not through official channels, but through the witness of those he'd saved, and the slowly changing attitudes toward combat trauma and moral injury. In 1946, Father Dubois traveled to the United States specifically to meet Thomas and personally thank him for saving his parishioners, bringing with him letters from the 40 Belgian families and photographs of the children Thomas had rescued. This visit was covered by a Scranton newspaper, and the reporter who interviewed Thomas and Father Dubois wrote a sympathetic profile that presented a very different narrative than the earlier coverage of the court-martial. The article included testimony from Belgian survivors describing Thomas's heroism, Father Dubois' account of those 6 days of evacuation, and details about the 40 lives saved. And public opinion in Scranton began to shift as people realized that the deserter they'd shunned had actually performed an extraordinary act of courage. This shift accelerated when, in 1947, the Belgian government awarded Thomas the Order of Leopold II, one of Belgium's highest civilian honors, for his humanitarian service during the Battle of the Bulge. The award ceremony took place at the Belgian embassy in Washington, D.C., and the Belgian ambassador gave a speech praising Thomas as exemplifying the best values of the Allied cause and arguing that true courage means acting according to conscience, even when authority demands otherwise. The American military was put in an awkward position by this foreign government, honoring a soldier they'd court-martialed and dishonorably discharged, and there were quiet discussions about whether Thomas's discharge status should be reviewed. But these discussions went nowhere because military lawyers advised that overturning the court-martial would set a precedent that could undermine military discipline, and the political will to challenge the original verdict didn't exist. Thomas remained officially a dishonorably discharged deserter in American military records, even as he was being celebrated as a hero by Belgian authorities and civilians. This contradiction, being simultaneously disgraced and honored for the same actions, captured the fundamental tension in his story and reflected broader cultural uncertainties about how to value individual moral autonomy within hierarchical military structures. Thomas's life gradually stabilized through the 1950s and 1960s. He married a woman named Catherine Walsh, who'd known him before the war, and who saw past the dishonorable discharge to the man beneath. They had 4 children, and he worked as a machinist at a factory that valued his skills more than his military record. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences and actively discouraged his children from asking about the Belgian award that hung framed in their living room, wanting to move forward rather than dwelling on events that still caused him psychological pain. The broader cultural context began to shift in the 1970s and 1980s as American society grappled with Vietnam War legacies and began to recognize that combat trauma was real, that soldiers faced genuine moral dilemmas that simple notions of duty and honor couldn't resolve, and that punitive approaches to desertion and conscientious objection had caused significant injustices. In 1987, a historian researching Battle of the Bulge personal narratives discovered Thomas's story through Belgian archives and wrote an academic article arguing that his case represented a watershed moment in tensions between military discipline and humanitarian obligation. The article brought renewed attention to Thomas's situation and sparked discussions among veterans advocates about whether dishonorably discharged soldiers who'd acted from moral conviction rather than cowardice deserved posthumous review. Thomas himself resisted these efforts, telling reporters who contacted him that he'd made peace with his choices and didn't need official vindication, that the letters he still received from the Belgian families and their descendants were recognition enough. He lived until 2001, dying at age 80 surrounded by family, and with the quiet knowledge that 40 people were alive because of choices he'd made 57 years earlier. His funeral was attended by 3 Belgian survivors he'd rescued, now elderly themselves, who traveled to Pennsylvania specifically to pay respects to the American soldier who'd saved them. Major General Raymond Clark, the commander who'd commuted Thomas's death sentence, never publicly discussed the case during his lifetime, but his personal papers, donated to the U.S. Army Military History Institute after his death in 1983, included extensive notes about the Dawson decision, revealing the psychological struggle it had caused him. Clark wrote in a 1969 private journal entry, "I've made thousands of command decisions in my career, but only one still haunts me 50 years later. I commuted Dawson's sentence because I believed executing him would be wrong, but I wonder if that was courage or cowardice on my part. Courage to defy military convention, or cowardice in refusing to fully embrace the harsh logic that military discipline requires. The Belgian civilians who survived because of him don't care about these philosophical questions. They're alive. Sometimes I think that's the only metric that matters." The psychological and cultural legacy of Thomas Dawson's story extends far beyond his individual case to touch on fundamental questions about military ethics, moral autonomy, and the limits of obedience that remain intensely relevant in contemporary conflicts. His case became a subject of study in military ethics courses at West Point and other service academies, where cadets debate whether Clark made the right decision and whether military justice systems should account for moral complexity or maintain bright-line rules regardless of circumstances. The consensus among military ethicists has evolved toward recognizing that soldiers retain moral agency, and that systems which punish all disobedience equally, regardless of motivation or outcome, are both unjust and strategically counterproductive because they alienate the very people whose commitment and initiative armies depend on. Modern military justice reforms, including revisions to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, have incorporated language allowing for consideration of extenuating circumstances in desertion cases, acknowledging that not all absences from duty reflect cowardice, and that humanitarian motivations deserve different treatment than selfish ones. Thomas's story also influenced broader cultural discussions about whistleblowing, conscientious objection, and civil disobedience. The recognition that sometimes the most moral action requires breaking rules designed to suppress individual judgment. His case is taught alongside those of people like Hugh Thompson, the helicopter pilot who stopped the My Lai massacre by threatening to shoot American soldiers, and Chelsea Manning, who leaked classified documents about military misconduct as examples of individuals who prioritized ethical obligations over institutional loyalty and paid severe personal costs for doing so. The question Thomas Dawson's story poses is as urgent today as it was in 1944. When authority demands actions that violate our deepest values, do we have an obligation to obey or to resist? When following orders means ignoring suffering, we have the power to prevent. What kind of person does obedience make us? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're practical dilemmas that soldiers, police officers, healthcare workers, and ordinary citizens face whenever institutional rules conflict with human needs. Thomas chose to save 40 civilians at the cost of his military career and nearly his life, and while that choice was vindicated by time and by the testimony of those he saved, it was enormously costly in the immediate term. The courage his story exemplifies isn't the battlefield courage of charging machine gun nests or holding impossible positions. It's the moral courage of acting according to conscience when everyone in authority tells you you're wrong, when your own survival depends on obedience, and when standing up for your values means accepting catastrophic personal consequences. That kind of courage is rare because it requires not just bravery, but absolute conviction that some principles are worth any sacrifice, and that who we are as human beings matters more than what institutions say we should be. The Belgian families Thomas saved understood this instinctively. They named children after him. They sent Christmas cards for 50 years. They traveled across an ocean to stand at his grave because they knew that his choice to help them wasn't a tactical decision or a calculation of costs and benefits, but a fundamental statement about human solidarity that transcended national boundaries and military hierarchies. Major General Raymond Clark's decision to spare Thomas's life was equally courageous, because it required him to prioritize justice over expedience, to risk his own standing within the military, to protect a subordinate who'd violated regulations, and to accept that perfect obedience and perfect morality sometimes conflict in ways that rules alone can't resolve. Both men paid prices for their choices. Thomas lost his military career and spent decades living with social stigma, while Clark faced criticism from fellow officers who believed he'd been too lenient and set a dangerous precedent. But both men also gained something invaluable, the knowledge that when they faced their most difficult test, they chose to honor human life and dignity over the easier path of simply following orders. That knowledge sustained Thomas through years of struggle and gave Clark comfort in his final years, when he looked back on a long military career and tried to determine whether he'd used his authority wisely. The 40 Belgian families who survived because of Thomas's choice went on to live full lives. They married, had children, built careers, experienced joys and sorrows, the full richness of human existence that would have been erased if Thomas had stayed at his post and followed orders. Those ripple effects, the hundreds of descendants who exist because Thomas saved their grandparents and great-grandparents, the contributions those people made to their communities, the love and art and work they brought into the world, are immeasurable but real, a testament to how individual moral choices can echo across generations. So what do we take from the story of Thomas Dawson, the soldier who became a deserter to save 40 families, and Raymond Clark, the commander who chose mercy over military discipline? First, that rules and regulations, however necessary for institutional functioning, cannot account for every moral situation, and that rigid application of rules without consideration of context can produce profound injustice. Second, that individual moral courage, the willingness to act according to conscience even at enormous personal cost, remains humanity's best defense against systems that prioritize efficiency over ethics. Third, that redemption and vindication sometimes take decades, but that living with integrity matters more than immediate recognition or reward. Thomas Dawson didn't save those Belgian families because he expected to be honored, or because he thought it would change how history remembered him. He saved them because they needed help, and he had the ability to provide it, and his conscience wouldn't let him do otherwise. That simple moral calculus, stripped of all the complicated justifications and strategic considerations that institutions use to rationalize inaction, is what heroism looks like in its purest form. The fact that it cost him everything makes it more heroic, not less, because it demonstrates that his values weren't conditional on convenience or personal benefit, but were genuine convictions he was willing to defend, regardless of consequences. Raymond Clark understood this, which is why he spared Thomas's life, even though doing so complicated his own position and challenged military norms. Clark recognized that armies fight not just to win battles, but to defend values, and that executing a soldier for living out those values in their most demanding form would undermine everything the Allied cause claimed to represent. As we close this chapter of World War II history, think about the moral dilemmas you face in your own life, the times when authority demands one thing and your conscience demands another, when following rules means ignoring suffering you could alleviate, when fitting in requires abandoning principles you claim to hold. Thomas Dawson's story challenges us to consider what we're willing to sacrifice for our values and whether we have the courage to act when action is costly. Drop a comment below sharing any family stories about moral courage during wartime or other difficult periods. Did your grandparents or parents face situations where they had to choose between obedience and ethics, and what did they choose? Let's build a community that remembers not just the military victories, but the individual acts of conscience that defined who we were in our darkest hours. If this story moved you, If it made you think differently about heroism and duty and the relationship between rules and justice, then help others discover it by hitting that like button. These humanized history narratives need to reach people who understand that war's complexity can't be reduced to simple stories of good versus evil. Subscribe to this channel for more psychological and cultural perspectives on World War II, stories that explore the impossible choices ordinary people faced and how those choices still resonate today. Click the notification bell so you don't miss our next video, which examines how a flawed British radar system accidentally became more effective than the perfected German version and changed the course of the Battle of Britain, another story of imperfection and unexpected triumph. So until then, remember that history isn't just about nations and armies and grand strategies. It's about individuals deciding in moments of crisis what kind of person they want to be and accepting the consequences of that decision. Thomas Dawson chose to save 40 strangers' lives over preserving his military career, and that choice made him both a deserter and a hero, proving that those categories aren't always mutually exclusive and that sometimes the most heroic act is the one that breaks all the rules. That's the history worth preserving, the history that teaches us how to be better humans when institutions demand we be worse. Thank you for watching, and never forget that courage isn't just facing danger. Sometimes it's facing disgrace for doing what's right.